The supporters of the privatization claim that private companies are more efficient than the public sector. Is that true, in your opinion?
No, it's not true, and not just in my opinion. If you look at simple technical issues like leakage, you find that the companies, the water companies with the best record on leakage, the lowest level of leakage, are in fact public sector companies in Netherlands and Germany. If you look more widely in an economic definition of efficiency, there have now been a lot of studies comparing public and private companies in the water sector and in other sectors. And what those studies show repeatedly and very clearly now is there is no significant difference in efficiency. So it doesn't make companies automatically more efficient by privatizing them. You can be just as efficient in the public sector.
Very well. And it is true that private companies invest more than public authorities in the public water systems. It's another idea about this subject.
Yeah, that's often believed, but again, that's not true either. And if we look firstly at the history of public water services in Europe and elsewhere in the world, ever since the late 19th century, is that services were taken into the public sector precisely because private companies weren't able to and weren't willing to invest the amount of money needed to extend systems and provide universal public services. And so from the 19th century onwards, the investment came from the public sector. Even in France, where the private companies continued to operate the system, they weren't making the investments. 88% of all the investments in France in the 20th century came from the public sector, not from the private sector. So that's looking at it historically. If we look at it today, we find the same picture. If you look at places where water has been privatized, for example in Hungary, there are some cities in Hungary where it was privatized, we find that the private companies are running the system, they're collecting the charges, they're taking the profit, but it's not them making the investment. The investment is being financed by the Hungarian government. If you look elsewhere in the world, if you look even at poorer countries, if you look in Africa or you look in India, for example, the private sector is actually investing almost nothing. All the investment is coming from the public sector. There's only very few cases where it's true to say there's been some investment for the private sector, and that's the UK is one example. But then what we see in the UK is that investment comes at a very high price. It comes at a price which means we are paying a lot more in terms of profit to the private sector in order to pay for that investment. And so, for example, in England, we're probably paying over €1 billion per year more than we would be if the same investment was being made through the public sector.
In Europe, the only countries where the majority of the water services are privatized are the UK, United Kingdom, France, Spain, and Czech Republic. What shows the results for the populations? The consequences.
Yeah. Well, firstly, to take the UK, as I've just said, we've found the investment that's been delivered has been very expensive. But what we found most immediately following privatisation was that prices went up very rapidly. And in the first 11 years after privatisation, prices went up by 40%, whereas the costs of running the service stayed almost exactly the same. So that means that we were paying an extra 40%, which was going purely in profit out of the system. So big price rises is the biggest single impact of privatisation in the UK, I think. In France, I think we can say the same, perhaps less dramatically because it's been longer established, but there was a very clear study done in France looking at every single water operation in France. Now, about 3/4 is private, but 1/4 is public, so you could make a comparison. And very detailed examination was made taking into account all other factors, and it came to a very clear result that taking account of all other factors, private water supply in France is about 15% more expensive than public water supply. In Spain, it's a bit more complex. I would say in Spain, one of the worst features is what we call eternal privatizations. So in Barcelona, for example, water's been privatized for 150 years, and it's never been put out to competitive tender. And it never is likely to, because anyone else who won it would have to pay the company that runs it at the moment huge compensation for their investments in the system. And that's what they found in the other major city in Spain that's privatized water for a long time, in Valencia. It was privatized in 1902 and for 99 years. And so as 2001 approached, people of Valencia got very excited. For the first time in a century, they could actually put water out to competitive tender. But then the company that ran it said, okay, but any other company that wins it will have to pay us 54 million euros compensation. So when it came to it, no other company bid. So the same company is carrying on for another 50 years. So this is terrible. It becomes really entrenched. It's like an eternal opportunity to suck monopoly profits out of people in Spain. Finally, in the Czech Republic, I mean, certainly there have been impacts on prices. There's also been quite sharp impacts in the Czech Republic on employment. Big cutbacks in the numbers of workers employed in the service there. And there's also been another interesting effect in the Czech Republic, because the European Union has large cohesion funds which are typically used to invest in improving water supply systems, one of the big uses of them. In the past, Portugal, Spain, Greece have all benefited from these funds. The Czech Republic was expecting to benefit the funds, but under European rules, those funds can't be used for the benefit of a private company. So because most of their cities are privatized, they suddenly discover they've lost access to public funds, which is much worse.
Your organization supports campaigns against water privatization. Why, in your opinion, the public sector is better way of providing water service to the populations?
Basically, there are two reasons in the end. The first is the simple economic reason that the public sector
is cheaper.
It doesn't take a big profit. Okay, it doesn't necessarily automatically follow it's cheaper, because the public sector may do other things with the money, invest in more careful supply of services, and invest in its second big advantage, which is democracy. The democratic accountability of the public sector makes it better. It makes it better, obviously, because it can be more responsive to citizens. It makes it better because it is clearly driven by a public service rather than trying to make money all the time. And it's also a very effective tool, I think, of creating efficiencies. That if you're subject to public scrutiny all the time, you've got less room for wasting money. So I think democracy and not having to take big profits out of the system are the two big advantages.
Okay, one last question. In 2010, 2 years ago, the United Nations declared water and sanitation as a human right. What should do the governments to the implementation of this human right?
It's a very interesting question. I think it's quite difficult. I think it's not difficult. It's different in advanced countries like European countries compared with developing countries. In developing countries, I think it's very clear. It really is a mandate to say that extending water and sewage services to everybody is a overriding priority. This is a human right, which means it's if you like, an economic right and a social right, as well as a political right. In Europe, in the vast majority of cases, we already have nearly universal connections and so on. So that's not an issue. But I think perhaps the important dimension of the human right, as far as Europe is concerned, is precisely the right to democratic control over services. Yeah. And that therefore countries should take it very seriously in Europe for the same reasons as they should take democratic control very seriously. Democracy itself is a very important value, and as I said, it improves the quality of performance as well as the efficiency of services.
Thank you very much.
Okay, pleasure. Obrigado.